I rise today, Mr. President, is to discuss an issue that really should be of serious concern to every member of this body, and it goes to the heart of the very nature of accountability in a democratic republic such as ours. There's an awful lot in our culture and our country that have been politicized and polarized. We all know that, even sports, certainly news, maybe even music, and definitely our government. And we've seen that manifested in many ways, including a recent debate over the filibuster. But there are some things that Congress has tried hard to keep from being at least overly politicized in our government. And one of those is monetary policy. And I think it's exceptionally important that we try the best we can, to the maximum extent we can, to not let politics infuse our monetary policy, because that's going down a very bad and dangerous road. Unfortunately, I would suggest that we have started to see that encroachment. We've started to see politics at the historically independent Federal Reserve. In the past month, the Banking Committee has held nomination hearings for 5 of President Biden's nominees for the Fed. Jerome Powell for chairman of the Fed, Lael Brainerd for vice chair of the Fed, Sarah Bloom Raskin for vice chair for the supervision at the Fed, Lisa Cook, and Philip Jefferson for Fed governors. What I think about this slate of nominees, so to speak, and I have different views on the different candidates, but one thing that's clear, this moment where we're going to decide whether or not to confirm these nominees is not just about the qualifications of the individuals. It's really a referendum on the role that the Fed is going to play in our country and whether it's going to remain an independent entity. Let me explain what I mean. So I know there are folks on the left, including within the Biden administration, certainly some within the Biden administration, who are openly advocating that the Fed use its enormous supervisory powers over financial institutions to resolve some very complex but essentially political issues, like what we should do about global warming, even social justice, even in some cases, education policy. Now, let me be clear, these are very important issues. These are big challenges for our country. But they are entirely unrelated to the Fed's limited statutory mandates and expertise, for that matter. And addressing these challenging issues of climate and social justice and education policy, all of them necessarily involve making trade-offs, some tough decisions. And in a democratic society, those trade-offs must be made by elected representatives, the people who actually report to the American people. That's us. It's a legislative body. These big, tough policy decisions should not be made by unelected and unaccountable central bankers. So the question's not about the importance of these issues, and it's not about the specific policies, but it's about who should decide. Who should decide how we proceed on these? Just take the case of global warming. So we could decide to limit domestic oil and gas production. If we do that, energy prices will rise. Americans will pay more at the pump to accomplish the intended goal of decreasing emissions. Well, how much of that is appropriate? To what degree should we pursue that policy? If we move aggressively to limit energy production, but other countries don't, then scientists tell us that global warming won't change in any significant way. Well, should we do it anyway? And how much of a change in the projected temperature of the planet should we insist on for any given amount of economic pain that we inflict on the American people? Look, I'm not here to debate the answer to those questions. Those are tough questions, it seems to me. It's not about whether you think those are important questions. I think they're very important questions. My point is that they're difficult choices and they have to be made by the accountable representatives of the American people through a transparent and deliberative legislative process. That's how we ought to make big decisions in this country. My concern about the Fed is it is wandering away from its mandate, it is overreaching, and there are some who are advocating that it use its enormous powers to make some of these decisions that the American people should be making through their elected representatives. By the way, this is not just a hypothetical. I have a number of examples. I'll just share one example where the Fed is clearly exceeding its mandate, engaging in political advocacy. The Minneapolis Fed. The Minneapolis Fed, the leader, the president of the Minneapolis Fed, with apparently the full support of the board of the Minneapolis Fed, is actively lobbying to change Minnesota's constitution, and specifically to change it with respect to K through 12 education policy. Now, does anybody think that how we pursue primary and secondary education is the role of the Fed to decide? I can assure you, it is not. And by way of warning, if activism, if this kind of political activism by what is supposed to be an independent central bank, if this is tolerated, then the potential for abuse is endless. And again, you don't have to take my word for it. I would argue that 3 of President Biden's 5 nominees, Ms. Brainerd, Ms. Raskin, and Professor Cook, have made a number of concerning statements that tell us exactly what they think the Fed should do outside of their mandated areas. Let's start with Governor Brainerd. Now, to her credit, she's chosen her words much more carefully than, say, Ms. Raskin has. But Ms. Brainerd has, nonetheless, urged the Fed to take an activist role on global warming. According to the New York Times, she has, and I quote, endorsed the use of supervisory guidance, the Fed's recommendations to banks, to encourage financial institutions to curb their exposures, end quote. That's exactly what I'm talking about. Using the powers of the Fed to pressure financial institutions to decide who gets credit and who doesn't. I'm particularly concerned that she's specifically advocated for the Fed to shape environmental policy through the so-called climate scenario analysis. Now, Ms. Brainerd and others suggest that they just want to understand the systemic risk that arises from global warming. But first of all, the Fed doesn't have any expertise in environmental policy, and the fact is there's no reason to think that global warming actually poses systemic risk to the financial system. It doesn't. As I've stated repeatedly, we haven't found a single bank, a single financial institution anywhere in America that has failed in modern times due to any weather event. We get hit with very severe weather events every single year, year in and year out. Never has a financial institution, but not a single one, much less the entire system. Now, Ms. Raskin, Sarah Bloom Raskin, who's the nominee to actually be in charge of the supervision of Fed-regulated banks, has gone even further than Ms. Brainerd in advocating for financial regulators to take this activist role with respect to global warming. Ms. Raskin has repeatedly, publicly, and forcefully advocated for using financial regulation in general, and the Fed in particular, to allocate capital and debank energy companies. Now again, Ms. Brainerd, Ms. Raskin will say that this is just about assessing risk. But in reality, Ms. Raskin has also said the quiet part out loud. In a 2020 report from a progressive organization, Ms. Raskin urged financial regulators to adopt policies that will, and I quote, allocate capital, end quote, away from energy companies. In a 2021 speech at the Green Swan Conference, she proposed, and I quote, portfolio limits or concentration limits, end quote, on banks' loans to energy companies. It's not because the banks can't withstand a credit loss if that should occur. Banks have, actually the American banking system is more heavily capitalized than it's ever been. That's not what it's about. It's about her view about climate change. In May of 2020, at the height of the pandemic, she wrote an op-ed in the New York Times specifically calling for excluding a single sector, the fossil energy sector, which she called the dying industry, from the Fed's emergency lending facilities. Now, the Fed, you could argue about whether the Fed should have ever stood up these facilities, but at least the Fed at the time had the good sense to say, if we go in and buy corporate bonds, we're going to do it through a vehicle where we do not discriminate at all among the many, many sectors of our economy, because it's not our job as the Fed to decide which ones get favorable treatment and which ones don't. That's up to markets to decide. It's not Ms. Raskin's view. She was very clear. She criticized the Fed precisely because they did not intentionally exclude fossil energy sector. This is a bad idea on many, many levels, one of which is, by the way, central committees that try to allocate capital in economies usually do a really bad job, and that's one of the reasons why our economy has outperformed the rest of the world. We tend not to do that. Many other countries tend to do that. I'll give you an example of where this can go. She wrote at the time, back in 2020, that even in the short term, fossil fuels are a terrible investment, end quote. Well, whatever you might think about the long term, the jury's back in on the short term. Investment in fossil fuels was absolutely terrific. That's just the data, right? The S&P 500 over the last 12 months is up 21%. Oil and gas indices are up 65, 70%. That's the kind of mistake that too much hubris in government can lead to. And Ms. Raskin's proposals would not be just devastating for energy workers, but also consumers who would end up inevitably having to pay much more for energy. And again, what's the basis on which she defends exercising these extraordinary powers? Well, it certainly is her belief that climate risk is so imminent, so threatening, and so devastating that it just requires this. And let me be clear, the folks, Ms. Raskin and Ms. Brainerd, they divide this into two categories, climate risk that is. There's the physical risk, and then there's what they call transition risk. Now, the data is very clear about the physical risk, right? Like an adverse event from severe weather events. They don't pose a threat to our financial system. Think about the things that we've withstood in the last few years. Hurricane Sandy, forest fires, devastating events. Name one financial institution in America that failed as a result. There isn't one. Not even close. They weren't even harmed, much less our entire financial system. So even Chairman Powell agreed there's no physical risk to financial institutions. So the one that they rely on is, well, but there's transition risk. Transition risk. Well, transition risk is really about changing customer preference. And that may, that happens all the time. Customers' preference change. I would suggest that bankers know how to manage changes in their customers' preferences better than central bankers do or regulators do. That's not that different from the risk they run every day. They lend money to companies that have a permanent risk that consumer preferences will change in ways that could be adverse for the company to which they lend. It's a fundamental part of their business to understand the risk they take of that sort. So what is a transition risk really? What transition risk really is, it's a political risk. And Chairman Powell pretty much acknowledged that too. The real nature of the transition risk is unelected officials like Ms. Raskin exercising the power she thinks the Fed should exercise, which is to step in and make it prohibitively expensive, for instance, for banks to provide credit to the energy sector, or put caps on how much exposure they can have to this. That's the risk. And I don't know how you do a scenario analysis when the scenario you got to analyze is one in which there's political moves to constrain your business. As I said, Ms. Raskin says the quiet part out loud. Now, let me turn to Professor Cook. Now, the administration cites her role as a director of the Chicago Fed as one of the main qualifications for her elevation to Fed Board of Governors. She is a director of the Chicago Fed. She was put in that position 2 weeks before she was nominated to be Fed Board Governor. She has a PhD, but she's done no academic work in monetary economics. And the few times that she has spoken about monetary policy, it's been a cause for considerable concern. So we've got unemployment at or maybe below 4%, inflation above 7%, and Professor Cook refused to endorse the Fed's recent decision to at least begin to withdraw the easy money policy that they've been pursuing. Let's keep in mind, today the Fed is still buying bonds The Fed is still throwing gasoline on the inflation fire. They're throwing a little less gasoline than they did before, and they do intend to phase it out completely by March. So we've got inflation roaring along. We're pretty close to full employment. And she couldn't bring herself to suggest that, yeah, at least we should accelerate the pace at which we withdraw the easy money we've been pouring into the economy. I don't know how Professor Cook could come to that conclusion. I mean, the fact is, inflation is it's multiples of what the Fed target is. It's at a 40-year high, and while wages have been growing, they're not growing as fast as inflation. So people's take-home pay goes up, but the cost of the things they need to buy goes up by more. That unambiguously leaves workers further and further behind. I'm also concerned that most of what Professor Cook has focused on in her writing and speaking and certainly tweeting is very extreme political advocacy. So, for instance, she's a big supporter of race-based reparations. She's promoted conspiracies about the Georgia voter laws. She's sought to cancel those who disagree with her views. She, in fact, publicly called for the firing of an economist who dared to tweet that he opposed the idea of defunding the Chicago police. And after Banking Committee Republican staff highlighted some of these tweets and others and brought it to the public's attention, Professor Cook blocked the Banking Committee Republican Twitter account. Maybe she realizes just how inflammatory her partisan tweets have been. But look, I mean, the Fed is already, in my view, suffering from a bit of a credibility problem because it has wandered outside of its lane. It has sought to influence policy beyond its mandate. And I'm concerned that Professor Cook will further politicize an institution that absolutely should remain apolitical. So, Mr. President, I'll conclude with this. Let's think about what's the danger here if we went ahead and confirmed all of these nominees. We'd be confirming partisans to the Fed board, contributing to its movement in a partisan direction, and ratifying the idea that the Fed ought to engage in what, in my view, certainly should be the domain of accountable elected representatives. They've told us this. It would be in global warming. It might very well be in issues of social justice. It might even be education policy, as we're seeing today. And this is not the role of the Fed. This is not appropriate. And it probably doesn't end there. You know, if this is ratified and if the Fed starts to go down this road, well, someday Republicans will be in control. Republicans will populate the Board of Governors of the Fed. And will those appointees decide, well, maybe the Congress doesn't spend enough money on defense, so maybe we should allocate some financial resources to defense companies. Or maybe Congress doesn't spend enough money building a border wall. Maybe we ought to find a way to subsidize companies engaged in that. Or maybe there's not enough offshore oil development and we should do that. Look, that'd be a terrible idea. That'd be a terrible idea. I might support those policies. I would adamantly oppose the Fed having the authority to decide anything about those policies. I know my Democratic colleagues have spent the last several months talking about how passionately dedicated they are to democratic values and democratic principles. And look, I think there's a lot of sincerity on the part of my Democratic colleagues. But certainly one of those democratic principles has to be that unelected governors of America's central bank can't exercise responsibility that belongs with the American people and their elected representatives. So I think the vote on these nominees isn't just about the individual nominees. It's about whether we're going to keep the Fed apolitical and independent and ensure that elected, accountable representatives make the difficult decisions for our country. If that doesn't convince my colleagues, then I would urge them to remember that in this line of work, one thing is always true, and that is that eventually the shoe is on the other foot. I yield the floor.